Hello again to our viewers, and welcome to another edition of IISS video series. I'm especially pleased this time to host Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch, who was the Chief Military Prosecutor in Judea and Samaria and spent a great deal of his career in prosecuting terrorists for heinous acts of violence against Israeli civilians. Maurice, welcome.
Thank you, good morning.
And I would like also to tell our video viewers that you are a research associate with IISS, so you're especially welcome today.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Perhaps you could tell our viewers more or less the story of how you arrived at this very senior position within the military legal system.
So I was born in South Africa. I grew up in Pretoria for the first 8 years of my life.
So a fellow South African.
A fellow South African, all good things coming from South Africa. And we moved to England in 1981. And there I went to school. I went to a Jewish day school. During school, I came to Israel for a 5-month program and fell in love with the country. I decided that I was going to make Aliyah, finished my high school. I then came to Israel for a year, and then I returned to England to my law degree. And at the end of the law degree, I made Aliyah and went straight to passing the bar exams. And immediately at the end of that year, I ended up in the Military Advocate General's Corps, where I was sent because I had done my thesis in university on the prosecution of Nazi war criminals, international criminal law, and therefore I was sent to the office of the legal advisor for Judea and Samaria. I spent 5 years there as the assistant to the head of the prosecution and as the assistant to the Attorney General for Judea and Samaria. I then spent another 4 years in the prosecution itself as the head of the appeals department and as the deputy head of the prosecution in Judea and Samaria. I then stepped aside from those subjects of dealing with terrorism and the Palestinians and went to be the head of the prosecution for the IDF AWOL Soldiers Division. I then spent 3 years as the head of legal advice to the Navy, the Air Force, the ground forces on the home front within the IDF. And then to my final position in the IDF as the Chief Prosecutor for Judea and Samaria from 2013 to 2017 almost. I now, having retired, I work on different subjects that are related to the Palestinians and Israel and that interaction, whether it be with Palestinian Media Watch, whether it be with NGO Monitor, or whether it be with the IISS.
Well, thank you. Perhaps you could tell the viewers something about the site where we're filming now.
So the site where we're filming now at the moment is really a historic site for Israel-Palestinian relations and for the prosecution of terrorists. We're standing here at the Ofer Junction, but behind us, behind the cameras, is the Ofer prison. The Ofer prison was set up in 2002 after Operation Defensive Shield, when Israel went into the Palestinian Authority controlled areas, Areas A, and arrested some 7,000 terrorists within the period of about 3 weeks. Further to the north, and what you're seeing behind us is the outskirts, the southern outskirts of Ramallah, an area called Bitunia. This is the road which in October 2000 will become really a deathly road. Two Israeli reservists trying to get to their base in Bet El, which is just the other side of Ramallah, will be driving along the road. They will turn left at this junction and end up being stopped by Palestinian policemen, Yossi Avrami and Vadim Norjic, 2 soldiers, IDF soldiers, reserve soldiers in their uniforms, will be taken by the Palestinian policemen to the police station in Ramallah, and there the Palestinians will lynch them to death, beating them with bars, with crowbars, with anything that could come to their hand, then throwing them out of the windows of the police station. The famous scene that you'll see is of Abdelaziz Swalcha, one of the terrorists who lynched them, standing outside waving his hands with the blood-covered hands for the mob and for the enjoyment of the mob to see. That's where we're standing. Immediately after that happens, a checkpoint is set up here so that no one else by accident finds their way into Ramallah.
I'd like to ask you about your assessment of the credibility of the Palestinian side, because there's been more than 3 decades now of constant international pressure to reach an agreement with the Palestinians which would include large-scale withdrawals from strategic areas in Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank. And before you answer, just let me give you a quote from one of the major architects of the Oslo Agreement, Shimon Peres, who once said in a book which was published in 1977 called Tomorrow is Now, he said the following about Palestinian credibility: "The major issue is not attaining an agreement, but ensuring the actual implementation of the agreement in practice. The number of agreements which the Arabs have violated is no less than the number they have kept." This is from page 255 in his book, Tomorrow is Now. So I'd like your assessment, A, of the quote, and B, of, in general, how much faith would you put in an agreement with the Palestinians, which almost by its very nature must include large-scale withdrawals by Israel from the high ground overlooking the coastal plain?
So I think, Martin, Shimon Peres, as was often the case, was 100% on the money. It is unfortunate that no Israeli government since the signing of the Oslo Agreement, and definitely no international governments or the international community, have demanded that the Palestinians keep their side in the agreement. There are almost no provisions of the agreement of their commitments which they kept. No commitment whatsoever. The basic commitment was to fight terrorism. They were now meant to fight against the Palestinian, inbred Palestinian terrorism, and they did nothing of the kind. They really nurtured even their own terrorist forces. It became the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. That is the military branch of then Yasser Arafat, now Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah party. This is an internationally recognized terrorist organization. That's part of Fatah, the so-called moderates that are leading it. They did nothing to fight Hamas either. There were piecemeal events where they actually did try and stop or arrest some Hamas activists, but really activists is the word and not terrorists. They did nothing really to fight the terrorists whatsoever. Their commitment was very, very clear and was breached at every level. They took all of the benefits of the Oslo Accords, the benefits that allowed them weapons to fight terrorism, the benefits that allowed them to pass their own legislation in order to fight terrorism, the benefits that allowed them to set up prisons, to hold terrorists in those prisons. And they kept none of those commitments. They have not to this day put on trial one Palestinian terrorist for attacking Israelis, not one. It's as if in the last 25 years of the Oslo Accords, there hasn't been one Palestinian terrorist. That's the value of their commitments. We see that on a daily basis on the number of weapons that are wandering around Judea and Samaria. In the Oslo Accords, there are clear prescriptions as to how many weapons the Palestinian Authority should have. And they've breached that from day one, from the first day when Yasser Arafat came into Gaza, sitting on a terrorist whose entry had been refused, and with weapons in the back of his car. That process has just continued on every day.
Well, sadly, I think this speaks volumes about the value of the judgment of the Israelis who agreed to the agreement, but that's a different subject. Let me go on to the next topic. The pay-for-slay phenomenon we see to the Palestinians. What can you say about the phenomenon itself? And secondly, about the Israeli attitude to it, and compare that perhaps with the US attitude to it, particularly with the Taylor Force legislation.
So the PA's pay-for-slay policy really is a prime example of breaching a commitment. Instead of committing to fighting terrorism, since the day that it was created, the Palestinian Authority has been paying two groups of people money to be terrorists, rewards for terrorism. One group is terrorist prisoners, terrorists who were arrested as part of Israel's response to acts of terrorism and were put into Israeli jails. They get a monthly salary paid by the Palestinian Authority. The other group of terrorists are terrorists who were killed whilst carrying out acts of terrorism, and their families are given an allowance by the Palestinian Authority. This has nothing to do with social welfare, as the Palestinians sometimes claim, because a rich terrorist who's been arrested receives the same amount of money as a terrorist who has no money. A family of a terrorist who had no one to support receives the same allowance as the family of a dead terrorist who had 50 mouths to feed. There is no social welfare or social benefit requirement attached to those payments. It's simply a reward for terrorism. Those payments have gone through different cycles in the Palestinian Authority. In 2004, Yasser Arafat, and then immediately afterwards also Mahmoud Abbas, even passed a law, if you can just imagine that, passing a law in the Palestinian Authority which says that we are going to reward terrorists. We're going to pay them a monthly salary. This is an unbelievable law, a law from 2004, which says that, firstly, the terrorists in Israeli jails are part of Palestinian society and part of what Palestine sees as its fighters. They refer constantly to the terrorists as prisoners of war. They see these people as soldiers. That's how they see them. And therefore you need to pay them a salary, even when they've been captured by the other side. But this is just a reward for terrorism, because not only do members of the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah, get paid salaries, but also members of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and every other terrorist organization, the PFLP as well. So that starts in 2004, where it's really codified. We, the Palestinian Authority, are going to pay these salaries to terrorists. In 2006, they will put out regulations setting the pay scale, right? The more time you spend in prison, the higher your salary will go.
In other words, the more severe the offence, the higher the reward.
Well, so at the end of the line, yes, the more severe the offence, the higher the reward. At its basic level, whether you're a terrorist murderer or whether you're a stone thrower and you go into prison for the first time, you get the same basic salary. But as time goes on, as you spend more time in jail, that's how the salary goes up. That's another prime example of why this has nothing to do with welfare. There's no reason why your salary should go up, why your welfare needs should go up while you're in prison. 70% of the terrorists in jail are single. Many of them are children. They had no real social welfare requirements. In 2010, Mahmoud Abbas, whilst telling the world that he is a leader trying to promote peace, Mahmoud Abbas will raise the salaries to an unbelievable level, to the point where someone who has spent, a terrorist who has spent 30 years in jail, a murderer, that's who spends 30 years in jail, is receiving now the salary that's equivalent to the salary paid to a minister in the PA government. It's unbelievable levels of reward just for being terrorists. So in answer to your question of the response to the PA pay for slay policy, we've seen really a great difference between the different actors. The international community, on the one hand, has recognized that pay for slay is a PA policy. It does exist, and it's something which they would technically condemn. Most of the international community, however, has simply ignored it. They've chosen the route of saying, well, our money that we donate doesn't go to pay for slay, and therefore we don't care what the PA does with its own money. That really ignores the fact that money is fungible. Excuse the PA from dealing with paying benefits to poor Palestinians, then they have that money to then pay for terrorists. America really was a great beacon of light on that subject, passing two pieces of legislation, the last being the Taylor Force Act, which says that any US aid to the Palestinian Authority is conditional on the abolition of pay for slay. No more money paid by the PA for terrorists. The general idea being that if the PA has enough money to pay hundreds of millions of shekels every year to terrorist prisoners, they obviously don't need US aid. Just some figures: in 2019, the PA spent 517 million shekel rewarding terrorists. That was just the terrorists in jail and the released terrorists, who every released terrorist also becomes an employee of the Palestinian Authority. So that was really led by America. Canada has also stopped funding. Australia recently also stopped funding the PA. Holland, just as recently as December last year, stopped funding the PA because of its pay for slay policy. So that's really the side of the international community. The UN, even the World Bank, turn a completely blind eye entirely. They don't care. The UN knows that this has been going on for tens of years, has said nothing about it, no condemnation. They're happy for the Palestinian Authority to continue paying for the murderers of Jews. That's one group of people. On the other side, Israel. Israel's approach, I cannot say, has been much better. For many, many years, the security establishment knew about the policy and chose to do nothing. The change came about in 2018 with a law that was introduced by, or a suggested law that was introduced by Elazar Stern and Avi Dichter. The law said that every year, as part of the Oslo Accords, Israel agreed to gather taxes on behalf of the Palestinian Authority, taxes that really belonged to Israel, but that came from the outside areas, and really to pass that money on to the Palestinian Authority in order to give it a way to function. So Israel was really gathering the money, giving it to the PA, which the PA was using to pay and reward the murderers of Israelis. So Elazar Stern and Avi Dichter's law said that every year we will take off from the tax money that Israel collects and gives to the PA, the amount that the PA spends on rewarding terrorists. The idea being that if we take that money off, then the PA will have to make possibly a moral decision as to how to spend the little money that they have, and possibly they would come to the right moral decision that you can't reward terrorists. It met with not a small amount of resistance, even from some parts within the Israeli government. Again, citing the same sources of, well, if we take away the money that they use to pay terrorists, it's going to bring about the collapse of the PA. That was one of the arguments that was heard. I mean, that's just not true. We've seen that the money's been taken off. Not only in 2019 did the PA not collapse, rather the PA economy even grew by 1.9%. That argument was just a lie to start with, but it reflected the desire of Israel's security establishment not to do anything effectively with that policy, something which has really changed over the last year and a half.
If I remember correctly, the initial Palestinian response was to refuse any money from Israel if they subtracted the amount for the terrorists. What's the situation today?
So really the first answer of Mahmoud Abbas was to say that if Israel even takes off 1 agura from 1 penny from the tax money, he is going to refuse to resect all of the remaining tax money. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the deduction is made in 12 equal payments. The first decision of the Israeli government was to take off 502 million shekel. Divided by 12, it became 41.9 million shekel a month. The first time that was deducted, Mahmoud Abbas decided to refuse the rest. What's the rest? The rest is some 630 million shekel that Israel was happy to give him. But so he decided to return the money. That saga went on for almost 7 months, until the Palestinian Authority said, you know what, even if you're taking the money off, we'll just take the rest. They made up all types of excuses that Israel had agreed to waive the excise duties. And that's why they'd really changed, made a U-turn on the decision. That's also not true. In order to waive the excise duties, Israel would have had to have passed a law in the Knesset, and the passage of that law would have been really dynamite for definitely for a right-wing government to come along and say, well, now we're going to give the Palestinians even more money because they reward terrorism. But that, from the Palestinian side, was something we see often, where you have one decision that they make, they realize sometime later that they've really climbed up a tree that they have no way to get down. So in order to justify their U-turn, they just make up, they come up with a story, they make up a lie, and that then becomes their reality. And today, the money is being taken off, the Palestinian Authority continues to accept the money, continues to function based on that tax money, as if nothing really was happening.
It's sort of accepted wisdom to claim that the Palestinian people are victims of their leadership. But I think basically the Palestinian public is the crucible from which that leadership emerged and developed. Because if you look at Palestinian polls, you'll find that there's almost unanimous support for paying the kind of money, the pay for slave money that they're getting. So this is widely supported by the Palestinian public.
I think there is definitely not a small amount of support within Palestinian society in general, I think, for the terrorists. It's a society that doesn't view terrorists in the same way that Western society views terrorists. Terrorists in Palestinian society are heroes. The Palestinian Authority, what we've been discussing a tremendous amount, is that the Palestinian Authority glorifies mass murderers, people like Dalal Mughrabi. Her only claim to fame in life is that she murdered 37 people. She is a national hero. The Palestinian school books teach the children to emulate, to desire to emulate Dalal Mughrabi. Abu Jihad, Khalil al-Wazir, who the PA attribute with the murder of 125 Israelis, is a national hero. In recent times, really taking anonymous minors who suddenly commit a murder and turn them into national heroes. Mohammed Khalabi, who murdered 2 people, became a national Palestinian hero. That's what the children see around. That's what society sees around. Spoon fed to them. That's what they see everywhere. That's what they see as names of streets, as monuments in public places, in the school books, on television, in every walk of life. That's what you see. That is the Palestinian society that feeds into this idea of terrorists, murderers are heroes, and supports then the payment of these salaries to the terrorists.
So let me ask you, if you were to single out a single event that sticks in your mind the most in your career in the military legal system, or even as the chief prosecutor, what event would that be?
So really I went through a lot of different examples that I could possibly explain. Some are more extreme. For example, standing in court for one of the first remand hearings of Abdelaziz Tsawalka with his blood-covered hands. From the terrorists, I think you grow almost immune to the levels of evil that you're exposed to. But really, I think one of the most unbelievable experiences was in March 2013, just days after I came into my position as head of prosecution, UNICEF, the UN Children's Organization, released a report on Israeli law enforcement in Judea-Samaria. I spent months trying to persuade both the IDF and the Israeli Foreign Ministry to allow me to engage with UNICEF, because their report was fundamentally wrong, both legally wrong, factually wrong. It was just a disgrace. It truly was a disgrace. They had plagiarized a report from a Palestinian NGO and made it their own. And so I eventually started discussions. I got the approval, and we had discussions with UNICEF. I led the discussions, and really there you saw, which really for myself was very sad, but also enlightening. The sadness was that you always hear that the UN organizations are so biased against Israel, and you know that to be almost true. But the reality of seeing that face to face was unbelievable. I showed UNICEF how almost every single one of their recommendations, every single piece of their report was just fiction, a complete lie, really a complete lie. I provided them with all of the evidence that we had in the investigative files. They chose to positively ignore it. Not only did they choose to positively ignore it, they chose to lie. Really, a UN organization lying about the content of our discussions, because it was better for them to save face to say that some subjects were still under discussion, even though there was no discussion. I had made clear there would be no more discussion on those subjects because they were simply fictitious to start with, and they remain fictitious. That same organization today, why did I take so harshly that report and single that out? Because that report really accused Israel of committing crimes against humanity. Widespread, systematic, institutionalized deprivation of liberty, that's what they had in the report, is a breach of, ostensibly, of Article 7 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It was a very, very serious claim that had never been made before in any UNICEF report ever. Only Israel was involved in that. And when they refused to change even a word in their report, they put out two update reports. The second update report was really acclaimed by the Israeli Institute as one of the best reports after my efforts that the UN had ever written about Israel. And yet it was still a disgrace. That organization, UNICEF, to this day, attacks Israel on every way, shape or form. It ignores the Palestinian terrorism. It ignores the root causes of minors being involved in terrorism. And that for me was really a harsh reality, to be sitting there in the room with UN staff who knew that what they'd written and said was a lie, and yet positively chose to perpetuate that lie.
This was motivated by anti-Semitism, or was it just sort of something against Israel as a state?
Well, I think the problem with UNICEF specifically was that UNICEF worked in such close quarters with Palestinian NGOs, some of them even with terror organization affiliations, and had really just drank the Kool-Aid. They just believed everything that they'd been told. They couldn't believe that Palestinian miners would lie to them, but they do. That's the reality. Palestinian miners say that we were forced to sign a statement in Hebrew, and you show the investigative files, and there's statements in Arabic. Well, how do you put that together? We were held in solitary confinement. Well, no, you weren't. International law requires you to hold minors together and separate from the adults. So if you're alone in a detention facility, you're not held in solitary confinement. You're just alone. And so part of it, in one of my discussions, one of the UNICEF staff almost specifically said that it is justified for Palestinian miners to throw rocks at Israeli civilians, targeting Jews. My response was harsh. I said to the head of the UNICEF that that's an unacceptable position, and if that's UNICEF's position, then the discussions have ended. This was really the first meeting we had. The discussions have ended even before they start, because if UNICEF as an organization can justify minors' involvement in terrorism against Jews just because they're Jews, then we have nothing to discuss. That member of the UNICEF team never came back again, and we had dozens of further meetings.
Let me end up with a final question about the coordination between the Israeli security apparatus and the Palestinian security forces. This has been lauded time and time again in the media as being extremely important in preventing terrorism. And I'd like to ask you, how durable do you think this is? How long can Israel rely on it? And who does it actually serve?
So I'm actually on record on that subject, Martin, saying that the security coordination is just a bluff. It's an entire bluff. It didn't really work before Mahmoud Abbas came into power in 2005. He tries to present the security coordination as something which is beneficial to both sides, and to a very, very limited degree, that is true. It's like many of the Palestinian misnomers. If you give it 2% of truth, then it becomes the whole story. And that really is the security coordination. Since Hamas won the elections, democratic elections in the Palestinian authorities in January 2006, Hamas won the popular vote. They should be the elected legitimate government. Mahmoud Abbas couldn't live with that. After a process, he deposed really the elected government of Ismail Haniyeh and replaced it with his own people from Fatah. That led to Hamas taking over the Gaza Strip in 2007, in the war for Gaza, as it's called, in the summer of 2007. And since then, Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas, and his PA have been fighting against Hamas. Now, Hamas for Israel and the PA is a common enemy. Hamas threatens Mahmoud Abbas's hegemony over the Palestinian Authority. It threatens the fact that he's been chairman of the PA for the last 15 years, in what it should be by Palestinian law limited to a 4-year term. This is just a disgrace, and Mahmoud Abbas knows that if there were to be elections again, Hamas would probably win. And therefore he uses the security coordination in order to provide Israel with the ability to arrest members of Hamas. The security coordination, at least in my experience, does not arrest members of Fatah. How did that start? That started also in August 2007, with the first agreement of Ehud Olmert with Mahmoud Abbas to come to the wanted persons agreement, as it was called at the time, whereby hundreds of Fatah murderers would be given a promise that if they were to stop their involvement in terrorism, they would no longer be chased for the acts of terrorism that they carried out during the terror war. And since then, that's been the security coordination. Now, Israel obviously has an interest to arrest members of Hamas, but it leaves the other people, leaves the Fatah people free to roam around. We saw it just recently with the arrest of Zacharias Bedi. Zacharias Bedi in the terror war, 2000-2005, was very, very active, a mass murderer, really a mass murderer, 7, 8, 9 people that he murdered, and he was wandering free. until recently, where he picked up a gun with his lawyer and they went out shooting at Jewish pastors, trying to kill Jews again. Zacharias Bedi was a senior member of the PA, Ministry of Prisoners. He was a known figure. He's a known Fatah figure. So why wasn't he ever arrested?
How essential is this coordination for Israel's ability to contend with terror? And what would happen if, as Abbas sometimes threatens, that the security coordination would end? What would that result in?
I think that the Israeli forces can deal very, very well even without the security coordination. The security coordination serves first and foremost Abbas. If it did not exist, then Israel would carry on arresting all of the terrorists that need to be arrested, even Fatah people that aren't reported to the Israeli side through the coordination mechanism. They found themselves in jail, Zacharias Bedi being the prime example. So I think Israel would be able to deal quite well even without the security coordination. I think that would be a different story for Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas would be and his Fatah party would have a serious problem getting rid of or dealing with all of those Hamas people.
Well, Maurice, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to help us with this important video. I'm sure our viewers will find the information that you've given them fascinating, and I hope we'll see you in a future IISS video.
Thank you very much for having me, Martin.
Thank you.
It was a great pleasure.
Thank you.